Well, for more on the economic implications of Theresa May's Brexit deal flop and the state of the UK economy, I'm joined in studio by Calvin Dark, President of RC Communications. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So as we saw there, Prime Minister May surviving this vote by 19 votes, what should we read into this victory?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that I saw was that the people in our own party that didn't agree with her plan that failed, what they agreed with less was a new election and possibly her losing. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic. And I've been cautioning myself not to say that she won. It's that she didn't lose as bad as she could have with today's vote, because she has till Monday to do what she spent the last 2 years purportedly doing.
So then how realistic is it? If in the 2 years before she couldn't get a deal that both sides could agree on, what do you think can happen between now and Monday then?
Well, if she does get it by Monday, it's going to be like, what were you doing these past 2 years? Probably. I would think that the most realistic option is an extension by the EU. But then we have to think about what is the incentive of the other EU countries to give them more time to do something that's not going to help the other EU countries. And I thought it was also interesting that the Labour Party has said that if the no-deal Brexit isn't off the table, they're not going to contribute. And I agree with them, because why would you want to sign your name to something that might end up being a no-deal Brexit, which most people are saying would trash the economy?
And speaking of the economy, obviously more uncertainty now, as we know that with this deal being rejected. Where does that leave the UK economy, and especially businesses who are wondering what they're supposed to be doing planning-wise?
I think that's just it. They don't know what they're going to be doing. And what I find interesting as an American is that if you think about the two most stable economies throughout the last part of modern history, the UK and the US, we're in a shutdown here, and they are essentially in a no man's land where they don't know what the next step will be. So I think that's kind of interesting that these two economies are in similar situations of uncertainty.
And certainly at the same time as well. Now, let's also look at what the Bank of England is doing. What should they be doing to really try and support the economy? We have inflation now at a 2-year low, and obviously still this continued uncertainty with Brexit.
Well, I think that whatever they do as far as inflation or other measures, because the economy has been kind of giving hints of, if there's a no-deal Brexit, of how damaging it could be. But I don't think there's anything really that they could do to help the economy other than ruling out a no-deal Brexit, which, depending on who you listen to, could be fire and brimstone or a minor recession.
Now, we know that France, Germany, and the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, they've all signalled that they're open to extending this March deadline if the UK requests it. But how much of a difference would it actually make, since UK lawmakers still aren't clear on what they actually want going forward?
I don't think it'll make any difference. And as the correspondent was just saying, if they wait too long, they've got to have new elections for the EU Parliament. And I think that the fact that 2 years couldn't produce an agreement that the Prime Minister's own party couldn't get behind shows you that till July or June, what is that going to provide?
So do you get the sense that perhaps the EU does want the UK to stay, or do they want them to really follow through with Brexit, since that's essentially what the people demanded?
What I think is that most people will want them to stay just for the economic stability in the other EU countries and in the UK. I think a nice plan B for that same group is a soft exit, which they're technically out, but with the divorce deal, as they call it, it's essentially meaning that for the important things, they're still together. But the hardliners in Theresa May's party, that's a no option. And I think the soft Brexit is worse for them than a no Brexit. So this is going to be an interesting weekend, because they have until Monday.
And so even when we get to the March deadline, you also have that 2-year transition period. What are the expectations? What's going to be different then at that point?
I don't know. And you know that when you brought up the 2-year period, I've been trying to find from our contacts in the UK what the feel is for a second referendum, And I found a lot of people that said, you have to respect the will of the people, right? And I generally believe that, except that the case has been made that people who voted to leave didn't know what leave entails. Now, I don't think many of them wanted to go through this exercise of 2 years to see how complicated it would be. But I think there's a legitimate argument for a new referendum now that people see leaving the EU isn't as simple as it was campaigned on to be 2 years ago.
So is it as simple as if they do have the referendum, does all this get undone? Or now that this doubt has kind of been thrown in about the option of leaving the EU, what does this actually do for EU unity?
Well, I actually think that if it will depend on if the UK gets out and how they do it, whether a no deal or like a soft Brexit. Other countries are going to be looking, and they're going to look and see what the ramifications were. At a minimum, this is a teaching case for any of the other EU members who have even considered getting out of the EU.
And so if you're a new EU member, perhaps looking to join the EU, if you're a country that wants to join the EU, does this give you any sort of warning or any sort of feeling of perhaps this isn't a good time to join, being that there is a lot of disarray and also a lot of right-wing politics also coming into the fray? Is this a good time to join the EU?
Well, I think the biggest thing is because the biggest economies are the ones that are considering leaving. Because why would you want to join a club where the people that could help support your economy are getting out? That's a bigger thing. I don't think this would have been a big a deal if smaller economies had expressed interest in leaving the EU. Because the reality is, whenever this is done, we're going to see what the EU looks without the UK, which I think will be very different economic power-wise and political power-wise. So
certainly raising a lot of interesting questions. Thank you so much. Good to have you on.
Thank you.
Calvin Dark there, President of RC Communications.